better.
Okay.
Tilt up.
And then I'm going to be sharing my presentation anyway, so.
Yeah.
All right.
Oops, we're transcribing. Let's turn that off. Stop transcription. All right, Mike, you can start anytime you like.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. There we go. We got to do the 3, 2, 1. There we go. Perfect. I'm Michael Wall. I'm the co-president of the Oregon Data Community. And here we also have Paul Turley behind the camera, another member of the leadership team. Jessica and William are off camping someplace. Hopefully they'll come back. And Arnie Rowland is not quite sure where Arnie is, but as usual, he's probably out traveling and having fun. Anyway, so this group has been around for almost 20 years now. We've recently moved our meeting place from downtown Portland due to logistical issues up to Vancouver because most of the leadership team lives up here. So we've been meeting now for almost a year in the Umpqua Community Room right in downtown Vancouver off of 6th Street. Everyone is welcome to come here, but we are also continuing to do our so-called hybrid approach, which is why we have the Teams meeting as well to allow people to chime in from wherever they want to. As you know, this is a community group, and I will say that we're always looking for speakers, and I'll bring up that point again too. So would love to hear from you. We're actively looking for speakers for next year. So feel free to send an email anytime you want to leadership@oregonsequel.org, and it'll get to all the people, and we can contact you if you're interested in being part of the leadership group. Let us know that as well. We'll have 2 more meetings this year, and then after that, we'll be taking November and December off. November is because we will be doing our SQL Saturday. This is one of the longest run SQL Saturdays, and we are going to do it again at Vancouver at Clark College. Same performance and for 11. We will be having same what we did last time. The tacos. So the only street tacos made right there. But also moving on with that. There we go. I just don't want to cause feedback. Can you still hear me? Can you still hear me? All right, good. Right, we just switched mics, so hopefully everyone can hear me. We don't have too much feedback. So because of the SQL Saturday, if you go looking for SQL Saturday Oregon 2023, you should be able to find our website. We are still looking for speakers. The call for speakers is still open until the end of August. So if you would be interested in submitting a presentation, please go ahead and do so. It's a fantastic opportunity if you'd like to get out there and start doing the career of speaking. Trying to think, let's see what else. At this point in the meeting, we usually talk about if people are looking for jobs or if people have jobs that are available. So is anyone in the room looking for a job? All right, Michael, would you like to say your piece? Okay, another Coke.
So good afternoon. My name is Mike Irwin, and I'm a SQL Server database developer. I've been doing this for quite a while, and I just happen to be between jobs at the moment. So looking for someone who needs SQL Server code and whatever written and tested and so on. That's about it.
I was going to say, we've known Michael for quite a long time, and he drives himself down here from Tacoma to come to our meetings in person, which very admirable trait. So definitely talk to Michael. So does anyone have any positions open at their company? No. Oh, hi, Lee.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Why don't you unmute yourself? I haven't talked to you in a couple of years.
Yeah, maybe you guys can't hear me here. Let me check my device settings.
Yeah.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, you guys can't hear me. Okay, great. So sorry about that. All right. Yes, so my name is Lee Coates. I'm a systems analyst out at the city of Gresham. And so my position, not for my position, but like a peer of mine, is open. So for a systems analyst, city of Gresham, Oregon. I'm going to go ahead and post a link in the chat. And it's a pretty classic IT job, somewhere in between admin and kind of like a business systems analyst position. So definitely more on the system side, but need to be able to work with people, have some people skills. And yeah, just help the city have a great infrastructure and modernize, moving things to the cloud. Definitely a huge SQL component to it. So I'll post that in the chat. Anyone who's looking forward to it, I believe it's open until September 6th. And hopefully we get some great candidates. Thanks for the time.
Fantastic. So our primary sponsor is Advanced Global, and they are not here tonight just because of some interesting logistical issues, mainly that their primary recruiter is in Minnesota, and then he's moving to Florida because he and his new wife have decided to live in Florida. But anyway, either way, so please do put your information in the chat. And what we do is we usually forward the email addresses and the contact information to Nick and let him work with the people. I know that he said that he did talk to some of the people from last month. And if you didn't, please let us know because we want to make sure that the connection is made there. So one of the nice things about this group is that, I mean, when I look at LinkedIn and I see people have lost their jobs due to layoffs or other things that happen. And the wonderful thing is when I see people, known people in the SQL community, and they're saying, you should hire this person because, this person's a great person. So there's definitely a lot of tangible benefits about that. And I mean, I can speak to this too. I mean, I'm looking here at Paul right here, and Paul helped me out in the number of years ago, and it's made the world of difference in my life. So I can't say enough about it right now. And in fact, next week I'm going to be going to Europe. And what am I going to do? I'm going to be speaking on SQL topics. So that's pretty darn cool. And it's just because of getting the opportunity and then putting a lot of time in to come up with some topics. And I admit that some of my first presentations were horrible and my topics were boring, but I kind of worked through it and figured it out. And one of the things with Paul, I still remember when he was showing me how to capture pictures. And he said, no, don't do it sloppy like that. He said, make sure you get the lines exactly equal on the picture when you're taking the capture. And every time I take a capture now, I hear Paul in my head saying that. I can't escape it. So anyway, again, and if you just wanted to talk about stuff too, again, either leadership@OregonSQL.org. I mean, if you had some questions or some ideas or stuff like that. Going back to SQL Saturday, so we definitely have room for volunteers. And all we would ask of you is that you would show up, commit to a 2-hour minimum chunk of time. But we have, in the morning, we have people who maybe can assist with registration, making sure people get a name badge on their stuff like that. This year, we are going to have a coffee service, so I don't have to hear about it. But there's still, we're going to need people in the different rooms. We're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tracks, I think it is. So we need people to help out with the room tracks. And we always need people at the very end when everyone's dead tired. When you're striking the set, you always need a few fresh bodies to help pick up stuff, pick up the garbage, and do everything you need to do. So it'd be very much appreciated if you wanted to show up. Again, one of the incentives, I guess, is if you volunteer for the event, then you also get invited to the speaker dinner, which we're going to be doing this year as well, too. So it's a fun way to meet lots of international speakers, because that's one of our trademarks is that we always put our event before Past Summit in Seattle. And so that way, a lot of the speakers come here and they, it's like they're going to Past Summit anyway. So they oftentimes will submit sessions to our event. And if any of you are curious about the SQL train, that one's a little bit up in the air. I've been talking to, that's another one of the Past Summit traditions where they would rent multiple Amtrak cars, and it would be a kind of a snack and drinking fest riding up to Seattle. The Chris Hyde, the fellow who normally puts it on, is not coming out this year. His backup is not quite sure. So in the meantime, if you are interested in SQL Train, we'll have something on the SQL Saturday website where we'll talk about the idea. I mean, we're not going to do SQL Train, but the idea is at least will help you get, for instance, there is a Amtrak station that goes up to Seattle. It's barely 10 minutes away from here walking. So it's not too hard to get to the Amtrak train. Well, maybe 15 minutes, but it's pretty darn close. So if you're interested in doing that. But anyway, let's get going. Any questions? And if you have any questions, both online or not, just go ahead and feel free to unmute your mic and just go ahead and say, I have a question. That'd be fine. I don't mind being interrupted.
First, do they have that in the, you repeat that when I
For our friends who are online, just go ahead and raise your hand or put a message in the chat if you want to ask a question, because we do have a little bit of a problem with feedback due to the unique configuration of this room. But feel free to interrupt. That's fine with a question. All right, there's Piotr. So anyway, so thank you again for coming. Let's get going on this. Heard some of this stuff before, but I do work for the company called 3Cloud, which is based out of Chicago, and they've made me an architect, so I get to build stuff. Oregon Data Community, been here for quite a while. Now I'm co-president, so I guess I worked my way up. And then finally, the PASS community member. So PASS is no longer the way it used to be, but it's still there in concept, so which is why we still PASS Summit, but it's not quite the same group. But either way, I still am going to encourage you to get out there. This is my slide for one of the events I'm going to be speaking at in Sweden. Again, heartily encourage you to speak. Traditionally, we actually used to always do where we would have like a 15 to 20 minute presentation, then we would have a 60 to 70 minute presentation. We've kind of got out of the habit of doing that. I'd love to get back into that. So if you'd be interested in doing a small topic, please submit to. I mean, in some ways, it's actually harder to do a shorter topic, but either way, if you're interested, if that's your comfort level to get your feet in there. We're going to talk about storage. Primarily, this is going to be talking about SQL VMs, the infrastructure as a service, but we're also going to be covering some of the things with Azure SQL and Azure SQL Managed Instance, but this is going to be about database topics using data in the cloud. And so because of that, we're going to go over some basic terms here. As far as this is Azure, but I mean, I know it also applies to AWS, so it's the idea of compute. So that's the CPU when you're building a VM in Azure. IOPS, input output per second. This is a very old term. It's been around as long as we've had computers. Latency, the time it takes for a transaction to complete its circuit. So if you were to press a button and then you wait for your GUI or your application, whatever, to return something, that's a latency thing. You oftentimes, gamers will talk about their latency or their ping time. Queue depth. Queue depth is a measure of when the CPU is waiting to do processing. So there's commands waiting outside to do stuff, and the CPU is usually kind of, if you see people knocking at the door, please feel free to let me know or we'll just let them in. DTUs, we're not going to talk too much about DTUs, but that was the original term that they used for when they created Azure SQL and also Azure SQL Data Warehouse, which has now gone to the name Synapse, and now it's called Fabric. But anyway, this still was the concept of it as kind of a one-size-fits-all measurement, talking about that. So to the cloud. I have my picture here of the Catio, which I just love these pictures. But anyway, one of the things that I think that companies miss when they go to the cloud is that they don't quite realize that when they're in their data center, a traditional data center, that they have a lot more room than they expect. And so once you go up to Azure or any cloud service, all of a sudden your time and your storage and everything is measured very carefully, because that's how these companies make money. So does anyone in the room feel comfortable describing a basic data center to me? Just really high level. Right, but right, and you have disk, right? Right. And they're connected via network cables. So nothing has really changed. I guess my point here is that going to the cloud is nothing different. I mean, it's still the exact same concepts. All Microsoft has done is just been very clever about coming up with systems in order to make sure that everything is networked together, and so that you have all of these systems there. It's no different than any other data center. In fact, there was once a fellow, I wish we could find that guy, I always remember him, who came and he did an impromptu presentation at our SQL group. And he talked about all the different fun stuff that Microsoft was doing, whether they were hiding data centers in plain sight. Apparently, Microsoft likes using storage units because they're kind of, no one thinks anything of them, but they can fit a lot of servers into a storage unit and they can rent them. And they experiment with underwater stuff too. The reason why I'm asking you about data centers, I mean, other than the fact that it's always been there. So what do you think that Microsoft is most concerned about when you buy Azure, aside from you paying on time? And what is their primary consideration about, their reputation? What, the data? What is it that they're most concerned about? The what? Right. You don't want to lose. You don't want to lose. Yeah, you don't want to lose one's data. That's a good answer, but that's not quite it either. It's time. It's integrity. They want to make sure that nothing happens no matter what. So yeah, it's like, because they don't want to have their reputation being affected by the fact if something were to happen to the systems. So because of that, everything up there in storage is all carefully placed around the fact is that they're going to sacrifice your experience a little bit and everyone else's experience a little bit in order to make sure that they never lose any transactions, because that's what's going to kill them. If people come back to them and say, well, why wasn't this transaction written to disk? Where's my data? That is what they are concerned about more than anything else. I mean, because if you look through all the Microsoft guidelines, they always talk about the uptime, and they promise anywhere from 90%, was it 99.0% all the way to 99.9. I mean, the classic, the 5 nines and stuff like that. And so Microsoft is going to do everything possible to maintain that. And that's an admirable goal. But because of it, over the evolution of Azure, that's why they've always done things a certain way. Way back when, I remember Buck Woody, who's a fairly known evangelist for Microsoft, and he's quite the character too. And he came to the Oregon SQL group and he was talking, we're eating Domino's pizza. And he was talking about Domino's, because Domino's was one of the early adapters. This was a long time ago, because this was before the OHSU room. This was probably back in the 2000s. And he was talking about how that they were one of the ones who adopted Azure SQL in the very beginning, because apparently Super Bowl is one of their biggest times. And they liked it because the idea is that they could scale out all the servers in order to meet the demand. And then when they were done, it went down. And back in those days, there weren't that many kids playing on the block. Has anyone here ever had cable TV, with like the original cable TV? Do you remember when it first came out? And so the deal is when they first rolled it out to the neighborhood, it was really, really fast because you were the only people who were on it. Well, over time, it became saturated because more and more customers started using up that bandwidth. So nothing has really changed. I should change this and lift and shift. So this, originally I did a presentation on lift and shift, which is something I do all the time for my work, but it's still the same sort of concept. But we're going to cover all three of these topics about going to Azure VMs, Azure SQL, and Azure SQL Managed Instance. Talking about compute again. So again, compute is the size of the VM. So if you go and do a Google search for Azure Marketplace VM, you're going to see a huge list of all the different types of servers. And you'll see everyone from their very beginning B classes, which are their tiny little servers, all the way up to these mega servers, which have and they grow correspondingly based on the number of CPUs, the number of RAM, and something that we're going to talk a lot about is the IOPS, because that's really what it gets down to. And you can see right here, these are kind of older servers. But when we were talking about here, so right here, IOPS. So, I mean, again, the CPUs and the memory are important. And the temp storage is very important too. But the IOPS is really what's key to your success of running any sort of server and more importantly, a database server in Azure. The reason I bring this up is that there's a throttle point. Remember what I said about how that the fact is Microsoft is more concerned about making sure that your transactions are successful more than anything else. So these throttle points are put in here in purpose. And so if you exceed the demand that's been allocated to you, you are going to be slowed down and you have no say over it other than to spend more money and to increase those throttle points. That threshold is there and it cannot be changed. And again, talking about IOPS. Again, the transactions, so databases are all about input and output. So if you do a request to disk, a read, okay, that's an IOP. If you're writing to disk, that's an IOP. If you're writing a bunch of things to disk, that's a bunch of IOPS. It's all about IOPS, and that's how Microsoft is keeping track of everything in Azure. Throughput, the amount of data that's being delivered, not quite as much of a big deal for your standard OLTP database, but it's definitely a concern about when you're talking about, for instance, like a data warehouse or some sort of an ETL type transformation. It's like, how fast can you get your data from one place to another? The transformation is actually a side effect. It's more of, I mean, now storage has gotten so cheap, databases have gotten so big. This is one of the things that was kind of my realization. What made me want to be a DBA is I realized back around like 2000 is that the whole world's going to become a database, and that's true. I mean, you think about it, every day, like when you go onto Facebook or something like that, or Instagram or something like that, you are writing to a database. All this information is being kept somewhere. Now, what they're doing with that's a whole nother story. But anyway. Latency, how long does it take? Like I said, so that is the actual request. So it's not the actual, not the request, not the IOP, where it's actually the request going and coming back. It's about how long does it actually, as far as your perception, does it take for that information to come back? The actual operation itself is the IOP. The latency is how long does it take to happen? And then again, QDEF. So the reason why QDEF is important is when I talked about the throttle points in the servers, that's where you're going to start seeing if that's the best way to see if you've actually reached one of these throttle points in Azure, and there's a couple of them. And so if you look and you see, I mean, whether you want to do it through perfmon, or if you even just want to go to the performance monitor within Windows, every Windows from the OS to the server has performance monitor, and you can go there and you can see the QDEF. And if you start seeing numbers more than like one, you probably have a little bit of a problem. If you see numbers in the hundreds, well, then you've got a lot of problems, because that means that your system is just waiting. It's like, I can't do anything because of the fact that I can't process fast enough. I want to do this. Hey, it's gone. And then finally, we have different kinds of IOs in databases. So we have synchronous IOs, which are fairly straight. They're serial IOs. So we were talking about things like log writing and backups. I mean, it's where it has to be done in a certain order in order to make sure that it can recover. That's why logs are written to disks in a certain way. Backups are written to disks in a certain way, because they have to be recovered. That's the whole point of a transactional database. Asynchronous IO, that's kind of going back to like maybe your classic, like the was it the airplane type thing? Or I mean, Paul's always had like the was it traffic controller? He uses that for his Power BI demonstrations. But the idea is that, let's say you have 20 different people buying an airplane ticket at the same time on the same plane, and they all reserve the same seat. Well, what happens? So someone has to get first. So then that transaction is actually completed and it's written to disk, and then the rest of them have to be rolled back. So the database has to keep track of all those different transactions going on at any time. So this is where you have the asynchronous IO, because you don't know where these transactions are going to go and where they're going to be. It's not as simple as doing synchronous IO. My cat volunteered for the picture, she didn't, but anyway. Any questions? Oh, yes, sir.
These stuff, in
We're going to talk a little bit performance. We're going to talk a little bit replication. We're mostly just talking about the different options you have. Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. So we can definitely talk about replication as much as you want. So. And as I said right here, as I said before, so you're paying for a service and Microsoft's only going to give you what you paid for. And that's important to remember. Microsoft's your friend to a certain point, as long as you pay on time, but they're not going to give you any more than you asked for. They may give you a few gimmies every once in a while, but basically you're going to get what you paid for, and you just have to pay more if you want more than what you're getting. Because you may run into this problem. Going back, one of the reasons that I originally wrote this stored procedure, good Lord, this presentation was because one time when I was working at a job, and funny enough, I was going to my first past summit, and there was a bad migration, and it was because there was a lot of concepts that weren't understood by the group that did the migration, and so that gave me a really good incentive to learn how all this stuff worked. And it's been valuable ever since to just understand it. Second throttle point, the storage layer. And this is the one that you are going to have the most control of, and you're probably going to run into at most times. This slide is a little bit out of date just because I'm just showing some of the smaller drives. They do go all the way up to the P80. But the point here is you can see right here. So this is, again, going to Azure Marketplace. If you do Azure Marketplace and you say storage, you should be able to find these are premium SSDs, and we are going to talk about the different types of storage. But you see right here, again, IOPS per disk. So these are the limits of the disks. This is how many that they can do per minute. Or I'm sorry, per second. And then the throughput for disk 2, which again, can be important. It's less likely with database concerns that you're going to run into throughput issues, but they do happen. But I guarantee you that you're going to run into IOPS issues when you happen. And when you run into them, what's interesting is I actually took out the slide, but I still have it around here, is if you look in Azure Monitor, what you see is it maxed out at the exact number where the IOP is. And that doesn't mean that you're having maximum performance. What that means is that you have maximized the possible performance of the drive. It's just not going to go up anymore. Okay, and right here, again, right, like I identified this. So let's talk about just some simple math here, or simple enough. So P30, so we're going to talk about synchronous IO because it's a lot easier. So imagine the calculation goes like this. So the P30 has a maximum of 5,000 IOPS, or 200 megabytes bytes per second throughput. The average latency is 2 milliseconds. So a single threaded sync IO transaction. So like if you're writing logs, you can see right here. So if you take 1 second, which is 1,000 milliseconds, you divide it by your latency, which is 2 milliseconds. That means that you are allowed 500 IOPS on this disk. That's what one database is going to do. So theoretically, if you actually had 10 databases writing to that drive at the same time, it wouldn't take very much to overload that drive. And this is my crude picture showing you can see kind of what's happening here. And so right here, this is where you would see your queue depth right here, because if these things are stacked up, if you saw 20 little guys waiting to do their work, that would be an example of queue depth, because they had to wait in order to process through the factory and do their job. So if we're talking about throughput, a little bit of a different here. So different, you can set the block size down to 4 KB, but in SQL Server, for instance, most of the requests are usually in 128 or 256 KB throughput. Because of that, whoops. If you're going to have multiple database read requests, and that's an example of asynchronous IO, where you're going to have all sorts of crazy requests coming from all over the place. So if you look at the 500, if you have the IOPS times the throughput, all of a sudden you can reach the max throughput. This is again going back to this P35, this P30 drive. So let's go over all this again. So if you have your 5,000, you have a 200 megabit throughput, you have 256K blocks that are coming through. And then if you have, all it takes is for 500 IOPS, because each one of those IOPS is an in and out on the disk, times 256K, which is the size of the packets that are being processed by that. Very quickly, you get to 125 megabytes per second. So that means that if you have, which is typical on a SQL server, you're going to have more than one database. It's rare that you only have a single database. So if you have a lot of active databases on the same server and they're pointing to the same disk, well, you can get the throughput limit pretty quickly too. This chart right here is just more to give you some of the ideas of, you can see what the size of the IOPS, the IOs are for different sort of transactions. And this is my with the cat thing, representation of async IO. Any questions? Yeah. Okay, so now let's talk about the throttling a little bit. So we're talking about the same thing with the P30. So if we're doing, let's say that we had 15 outstanding IO. So let's say that for some reason you picked a disk. So a P30 disk is a terabyte in size. Let's say for some reason you wanted to have 15 drives, 15 databases writing to it, and you're doing log writes. And we're doing the same basic example where that they were all, for some reason, they're doing their transaction log writes at the same time. If you had 15 of them, all of a sudden you're going to get to 7,500 IOPS. So what happens then is that you exceed your maximum IOPS. And so what happens is that you get penalized when it's writing to that drive. And because of that, the late goes up by a millisecond. And it'll keep on getting worse and worse, because what it'll do is it'll divide it. It'll make sure it'll try to keep your work going through, but it will also slow down things in order to maintain the consistency of all the transactions. It's not just your individual writes to your drive, it's all the customers who are writing to the same storage unit. Because that's why I asked the question about a data center, is that all of your storage is located in, remember, SANs and such like that? I mean, that's what it is. It's going to be a lot of SANs all over the place. And there's lots of people who are using these SANs at once. As you can see, it can get really bad if we were to go crazy. And part of the problem is that they're checking every 50 milliseconds to see if you're exceeding the throughput. So that's the thing, is that it doesn't take very long for you to get to that limit and for you to be punished. And again, as I said, again, performance is being sacrificed for data integrity. Yes, we'll talk about storage a little bit more. So the evolution of storage. They don't really use rotational disks, even though they're still an option. So when you go to the Azure Marketplace, you can see the different choices for disks for VMs. And so you still have the standard HDDs. That's the lowest tier. That's still the rotational disks. But mostly Microsoft is pushing you to go to SSDs. And one of the things I wanted, kind of exciting to talk about, is the brand new category that just came out, which is the Premium Disk version 2. So we'll talk about those a little bit, and also cover Ultra Disks, which are the most expensive option they have, and that's for the customers that really need the high performance environment, things like SAP and things like that. So about the data centers, so apparently the very first data center was actually in Quincy, Washington. After Microsoft got done kind of testing things out, that's where they built their first Azure data center, and then they just kept on growing. So here's a map of Europe where you can see all the data centers close by to each other, and then the US. And I know that they're actively building more and more of these, but you have to think about, what does it take in order to make this network and make sure that everything is working together? I mean, that's really what kind of the magic of what Microsoft has done here, is that it's not that they're providing the service, it's the fact that they're providing a consistent service. And the fact that you know that in case someone drives a backhoe through some sort of major fiber cable or something else happens, is that your data is going to magically show up in another data center, because they're making sure that it's replicated all across the area and the different regions. Now, you have to pay more if you wanted to go from one end of the US to the other, but still the whole point is that they're making sure that your stuff is always safe. Again, all of your requests are actually network requests. So when you're connected to Azure, the main pain point for your server or for your applications is going to, once again, be your network connection. So if something happens to your network connection, your customers are all going to be unable to do their work. Now, I mean, that's not really anything new. Ever since data centers became a reality and virtualization became a reality, it's been a long time. I mean, I know that there's still companies that still have servers in-house, but it's not nearly as common anymore. So right here, I put up this this map here because I wanted to show this is, so when we're talking about, so here you have your VM right here. And what I wanted to point out is the fact that this is the experience when you're dealing with the lower end storage right here. So you're going here, and so this is going to be for your Azure SQL, and this is going to be for the lower quality of disk, the premium disks. As you can see right here, this is kind of the key point right here, is that it has to go through multiple hops just to get to your drive. So, you know, if you're paying for premium storage, which is not cheap in Azure, these guys are really annoying. So when you're paying for that premium storage, every one of these requests has to go through all the way to the SAN, wherever Microsoft might have placed it. And you have to remember all the way along the way is that they're making sure that there's all that data is going to be good. So they're doing checks on every single hop of the way, which is only going to add to the time it takes to get to it. Which is why the idea at first it was UltraDisk. As you can see here, they took out 2 of the steps. So instead of going to, you know, right now you have it right there. And then with these new premium version 2 disks, that's also exciting because it's the same sort of concept. So you don't have to deal with that anymore. Does anyone have Azure SQL or Azure SQL Managed Instance? Are they working with any of those? So I talked about the cable analogy. You notice how originally they just had the basic service general purpose, and now they rolled out business critical about 5 years ago. That's partly because of demand, but it's also because of this, because what was happening is that people were using the basic service and then they ran into an issue where they just weren't, you know, it's not just because people that they need more performance. It's also because the service became saturated. And so they came up with a way in order to give you that, because everyone liked the cheaper option. Of course they do. It's only natural. Yeah.
So much difference to probably it's
It's just another data center. Yeah. I mean, and that's a whole other discussion, but that's when you get into to the zones and such like that. So you're keeping track of that. And so Microsoft's not going to tell anyone where the storage is, because that's the key to everything. But obviously they're going to keep different, basically the warehouses where they're keeping their SANs closer within the different areas. Right. And I mean, that's one of the things, I mean, if you want for a certain uptime, so you have to agree to have, whether not the geo replication is the highest level of service, but you do have to agree to, I'm trying to remember the different ones. You have the, see, now the words are escaping me, but the whole concept of that you have within the data centers themselves, and then you have within the region itself. So you're paying for those different services because, like, for instance, if you're doing, because they are going to do downtimes and they tell you that. So you have to pay for the different services to make sure that there's always 2 data centers, or 2 within the data center, that there's always going to be servers that are up, and then within the zone or the region itself, then you're going to have availability zones. So you're going to have, that represents multiple data centers all working together. And then if you want to have across multiple regions, and that's when you have to pay quite a bit more in order to get that service. But I mean, I'm sorry, that was kind of a long-winded answer, but what you're talking about. Part of the thing, one of the things that's interesting, I know from talking to people from around the world, is that there's definitely a different price. So like, for instance, I set up when because I was planning to go to Norway, and so I set up a server in Norway, and I set up one at US West because I was just curious about the cost. And there definitely was a difference in cost. It wasn't huge, but it still would add up over time. I think that partly has to do with the volume thing, whether Oh, I don't think they were interested. So. Anyway, so it was, and I know that talking to some people down South America, that it's really expensive down there. So I think that some of it also just has to do with the general economy of the country too, and what the availability of the resources are. Sure, go ahead. Or,
How do we found not the same as valid? Deal with the physical storage region situation.
I have no idea. I just, it's okay. So you're talking about something like in, okay, so you, how do they deal with it? So, you're talking about like, are you talking about like a Cosmos deployment type thing? Is that what you're talking about?
You,
Sorry, not sure if you can hear me.
You can hear, you're welcome to elaborate with the question.
We could follow up on this later if that's all right.
Well, I mean, I can, one answer is that I know that one, at least it's been a little while since I've worked with Cosmos, but one of the limitations is that you can't do it all at once. So you have to do it kind of in a forking sort of method. So, because I think the limitation is that you can have 4 replications of any set of data at one time. And then from each one of those, you have to build off, you have to spread out a tree in order to get to all 24 of the regions within Azure. So that's how it works if you're paying for that service. Does that kind of answer your question?
Got it.
Okay. Okay.
And incidentally, there are 2 of these products called average. So there's one then more data. Then water and lake plant.
Right, it just makes it complicated. So we're okay. So we were talking about storage a little bit. So rotational storage. So the other thing to remember is that they're still using rotational disk for blob storage. I think that Microsoft's goal is to eventually get away from rotational disk, but right now they still have a tremendous amount of money invested in it because that's what they put originally everything into. And why are they going to, if it ain't broke, why fix it? So that's one of the limitations. And so that's why you're always going to have slower response. In fact, I know the maximum number is when you're talking about IOPS. So I think the maximum IOPS for blob storage is, I think it's 200 IOPS and it's 60 megabytes per second throughput. So it's quite limiting. One of the things to remember, which is why you probably want to go right to premium disks. Premium disks have been around for a good 10 years now. They're all SSDs, but your mileage may vary because a lot of them are going to be going back to SATA and SAS type attachments for the drives. I mean, again, they're going to have whatever the storage devices that they bought at the time, and they're going to keep on using these drives and provide this. So because of that, your performance is going to be somewhat limited. The biggest problem with premium disks, in my opinion, is the fact is that when you look at them, the problem is that in order to get the performance level that you want, you have to buy a much bigger disk as far as size goes than what you probably need. And so because of that, one of the things when I'm working with my customers is I recommend that they do striping, because striping is a fairly cost-effective way, if a little bit mechanical, in order to get the performance levels you're looking for without having to buy a really, really big disk. And the striping itself is not horribly complicated. There's lots of scripts out there too, and I believe you can use DBA tools now to use it as well. But it is something you have to do in PowerShell in order to set up. I mean, I've done it a few times before. And you have to make sure that your OS, you have to at least be on Windows Server 2012 in order to pull that off. As you can see right here, so this is kind of what I was alluding to as the sizes. So you can see right here. So up here, I mean, you have to go ahead and pay for a 2 terabyte drive in order to get 7,500 IOPS, or the throughput that you might need. And you can see here as you go up in the tiers, the space doubles and you get a little bit better performance. So one of the problems of being a modern DBA in Azure is that you have to think about these things when you're sizing out your servers, because obviously you don't want to spend too much money on the storage, but yet you need to spend money on the storage in order to make everything work. So you have to kind of come up with questions whether maybe you want to allocate a drive to each one of the databases, or maybe you want to do striping. So for instance, the cost, it's about 30% less. So if you were to go ahead, let's say if you were to take a bunch of P30s and you were to stripe 4 of them together, you would have a 20,000 IOP disk, and you would have the corresponding throughput as well, but you would still have a 1 terabyte disk. So it's just a matter of what you want to do, because you probably don't need more than 1 terabyte for it. Well, it depends on your applications, of course. Any questions on that? Premium Disk version 2 just came out, barely made it to general availability. And like most things with Microsoft, general availability means it's very limited into the regions it's limited to, and you're also limited on the type of servers. The really cool thing about, so where we went back to when we were talking about here, is that this limitation about how you have to keep on buying this. So the reason why V2 is so cool is all of a sudden Microsoft is listening to people and they're saying, oh, okay, so you want to actually size the disk the way that you want to. Now, they already tried that with UltraDisk, and I put UltraDisk on the bottom, even though UltraDisk actually came out a number of years ago. They came out like 4 years ago. But I put UltraDisk on the bottom because still it's the most expensive option, and it does have the greatest range. V2, I am sure there's going to be lots of stuff about it because Microsoft has now created a sweet spot that most customers are probably going to go to if they can go to that, because it's going to make it a lot different for their databases. So, but now, of course, one of the differences here is that once you go from the standard and the premium disk version 1, is that normally you're billed by the day, and all of a sudden now you're billed by the hour. So wouldn't want to miss out on any money there. Again, they're sizable. Sizable from 1 gigabyte to 64 terabytes. And you actually do get something free here. So when you set up one of these disks, you get a baseline of guaranteed of 3,000 IOPS for free, and you get 125 megabit throughput. So even on the smallest 1 gigabyte drive, you're guaranteed you're going to get a reasonably fast drive just out of the box. They don't start charging you until after you get above that point. Again, the reason why this is cool is because it's giving you that choice to do that granularity. So the prices, I haven't had a chance to, the pricing calculators are not working quite yet for the V2s. I've just been playing with them a little bit on one of my servers. But the idea is that they're still going to be cheaper than spending money, and also the manageability factor too. So now you could finally size like maybe a 200 gigabyte drive that's going to have the performance characteristics that you need for your server, instead of having to buy, for instance, like 5 P40s and then have a 2 terabyte drive that you're paying for every month. Because just because you're striping them, you're getting the performance, you're still paying for 5 drives or 4 drives or however you're striping. I mean, it's a bit of a logistical nightmare too, because every time you don't lose things when you reboot the server, but the point is if you move the server, let's say you had to what's the word? Not decommission the server. If you had to decommission the server, if you would have to redo and you had to move it around, you would have to redo all those drives. So it makes administration more of a nightmare as well too. The other, trying to think, what is it? Let's see. Oh, of course, on the right. And so then the other thing, so I mentioned about the idea of using older disk interfaces. So when you're talking about if you're using SATA and you're using SAS storage. So they now have the category where they're using these new drives are going to be using NVMe. So it's going to be using the very fastest possible technology for the disk interface itself. I mean, one of the things like in PCs, if you have your own personal PC at home, one of the fastest boosts of speed you can do is you can buy an NVMe boot drive. Essentially, that's what you put your OS on. So instead of having it connected to the backplane, it's right. I mean, it's directly connected. And then finally, UltraDisk. Again, the biggest problem with UltraDisk and probably with the premium V2, even though I think they'll change it, is the limitation. It's going to, much like how that Microsoft throughout the years has forced customers to upgrade their servers and their OSs in order to use the newer stuff. You're going to have to look at your regions, you're going to have to look at your servers in order to use the newer stuff. As you can see right here, so again, with UltraDisk, one of the limitations is that you have the size here, and so it's kind of similar to the premium disk, where the idea is that you have the cap for based on this. It is fast. My experiment with UltraDisk, I mean, UltraDisk charges you by the minute. I did do some experimentations with a server where I put TempDB onto a 10 gigabyte UltraDisk, and it was incredibly fast. I mean, there were definitely no problems. I ran all the tests I could on that thing, and it was just slamming through everything.
Yeah, you know how SharePoint is back.
Is
Just what type of disks they use for.
they're probably using blob storage. I mean, that's one of the things working with Microsoft products for a number of years now is I see how Microsoft is using technologies again, like always on availability groups. They're using log shipping and replication. It's just that they've kind of repackaged it and put it into a nicer form, but still the same core technologies that are being used. And same thing with, I mean, I'm sure Microsoft is going to get away with that. I mean, just like look how slow Teams is. I mean, Teams is SharePoint. So, you know, most people are tossing all of their crap into their Teams folders, and they probably don't look at it more than maybe once a month or something like that. So why would you want to put faster disks on there? But that's just my theory. I don't know for sure. Yeah, good. Yeah, and I'm kind of wondering if they're going to, for instance, if they're going to eventually offer like a OneDrive business critical tier or something like that for people who want a little bit faster service. Because I've been working on a side project with my son, and we've been scanning a lot of documents, and he's scanned something like 30,000 documents, and you can definitely see that the OneDrive. It's interesting watching when he loads them up into the OneDrive and then how long it takes, and it's pretty speedy overall when I retrieve the documents, but it's definitely using it more than just a few family photos. It's actually like a real file server now for what I'm using it for. Yeah. But it's exactly what I needed because they were all paper documents, and my goal was to get them so that they couldn't be destroyed. So now they're safe in the cloud, and so if a fire were to happen, you know, at least they're recoverable. Again, put up this chart right here from Microsoft. This one's pretty easy to find, and I can certainly send the slides. And you can see right here the limitations going through the different types of drives. Again, talk about the standard, you know, right here. This is probably where we're doing things like SharePoint and all the lower end applications, the lower demand. Again, also seeing the IOPS right here, where you can see the, you know, where you can max out. And this is where UltraDisk truly shines. So if you actually had some sort of an application where you actually had 160,000 IOPS that you really need to do that much, that's where you would go. But, oh yeah, and this chart is kind of cool too, this flow chart right here. But again, just given the idea of where, you know, Microsoft has put this in here, where you're thinking about what you probably need based on your demands. And I've done lots of things on Azure SQL using just general purpose, and it works just fine. I mean, it's rare that people actually have applications that really need that much performance behind it, but when you need it, you need it. I mean, sadly, oftentimes it's usually poor code and everything like that. So sometimes you have to throw hardware out in order to make it work better, but sometimes you just need to do that. But, so let's talk about VMs a little bit. This isn't truly about storage, but I just think it's very cool and something to think about because we're going to talk about VM throttling a little bit. Is it constrained cores? So this is something that Microsoft doesn't advertise very often. But the truth is with modern SQL Server, their catchphrase ever since with SQL Server 2016 is it just runs faster, which is true because as of SQL Server 2016, they started rewriting the whole code base. They didn't reuse everything from all the earlier versions. And they've continued that process with 2019, 2022. And because of that, you don't need that many CPUs anymore in order to have a database server. And so, but Microsoft is charging you on licensing based on the number of cores. So why do that? So when you look at here, so you see like right here, so the standard E16 and see the -8 right there. So what it is that it only has 8 cores active, but you're getting the chassis, the computer of an E16, which means that you're going to get the performance characteristics, mainly the RAM and then the IOPS through the maximum IOPS you can have for the server because of that. So you don't have to pay for all the CPUs, but you're getting a much beefier server. So it's something that's been kind of talked about for a long time. It's cool that Microsoft finally made a legitimate way because people used to do all sorts of screwy things where like they would go into the BIOS and they would turn off the cores and they would do stuff and it would usually just break the server. And so now you can actually do it legitimately. So one of the reasons this is relevant is because VM throttling. So when I talked about how the disk was your first throttle point, so when you get to the VM, that's another throttle point. And so when you see right here, so this is the disk, or this is the server, the throttle point right here. So it's not as common that you get to it, but look at the server right here. So this server has a max of 8,000 IOPS. So if you slapped 4, like say P40s, which all have a 5,000 or P30s have a 5,000 max IOPS. So theoretically, those 4 drives together could do a 20,000s of IOPS. And if you have a little server that has a maximum 8,000, that's going to be your first throttle point. So it doesn't matter how much storage you put against it. That server is going to keep you from going fast as you want to go. So that's one of the reasons why constrained cores is one way to get around that struggle. Or else you have to go up and you have to buy a much bigger server, which costs a lot more money. So I put this in just, you have to keep track. We're not going to get into caching because the truth is that what I see is that because of the V2 disk, which is exciting because you're not going to have to worry about caching so much anymore. Caching was a very complicated calculation, which is why mostly we're going to be worried about the uncached thing right here, because this just got really complicated. Best practices right now when you're setting up VMs in Azure is that you want to go ahead and you put read caching on your data drives, and then you leave your log drives alone. You put no caching on it, but that over time that caching can add up too. And then this is kind of like the example I was talking about, exactly the example I was saying right here. So if you have, again, you have so many P30s right here. So these things right here potentially could do 15,000 IOPS. And if you don't have enough, it all depends on this. The point of this is that you have when you get really down to it, you can have combined uncached and cache limits. It's pretty easy to exceed any one of them if you're not paying attention to it. So another brand new thing, which is kind of exciting, the nickname of Double Sprinkles from Pamela Hood, she's the data goddess up at Microsoft and knows everything there is about storage and SQL Server. But anyway, so this is the new latest and greatest servers right here. And this is probably going to be your goal currently if you are a database administrator at your company and you want to get them into if you want to get your servers on, you get into Azure. And one of the things that's exciting about these is, first of all, is that they can use the premium V2 drives. And the other thing is the fact is that they are, the servers themselves can actually use the NVMe RAM or drives as well. So what Microsoft has finally come up with is that they've come up with it, you don't have a limitation. So the idea is that these servers are going to probably be about 100% faster than an equivalent older style of server. So if you line up everything correctly, you're going to have true database performance that you want to have. And actually at a cost that's not going to be much more ridiculous. It's not going to be more ridiculous than what you would be paying for older styles where you're stacking a lot of stuff on it. And her nickname is Double Sprinkles. So anyway,
Donut.
it's a donut. I know it's a donut. It's a, yeah, it's exciting. So you can see right here. So, because of this, if you've got it lined up correctly, so not only the local storage, and the reason why that's important, because that's where you're going to put your temp DB on the server, is that you're still connecting to remote disk storage. I mean, there's only so much that you have there. They're saying that they're allowing up to 260,000 IOPS throughput, which is crazy. Okay. Any questions? Yes, sir. Where do you want what? Yeah, I have to admit that that's a little bit crazy. I mean, I know that back when I used to be in charge of a data center, we used to have two. We'd use two usually because you would oftentimes have like a backup subnet, but that's about it. I know I can't imagine either. So I don't know. It's not ignorance. It's a matter. I think they're just saying, well, you could do this if you really wanted to.
Application.
I think it would be more, I mean, if I were just, to spitball, maybe if you had a lot of NAS type stuff, locally, maybe that would be a need to have multiple NICs, but other than that, I'm not sure. So, because I mean, NAS is you have to run, I mean, again, that's the whole idea through the network. So that may be one reason. But that would be a pretty unique thing, and it would probably involve security or something like that. So I'm not sure. All right, so let's talk about Azure SQL Managed Instance a little bit. This is a little bit small, but anyway, this is the best chart I could find that talked about the comparison of the different Azure SQL options. So again, general purpose is what most people are going to use. They released business critical and hyperscale. And the important thing I want for people to look at is you look right here. So you can see here you have the IOPS and you have the storage size. And then you can see here, see how this changes dramatically? So this is kind of a giveaway right here, is what they're doing is that you can tell that they're putting a bunch of slow drives together. This is essentially blob storage, but what they've done is they've kind of put a bunch of different options together in order to get this maximum IOPS. But here, when you see it go up to 200,000 maximum IOPS, so what my theory is probably what Microsoft was doing is that they were testing out these V2 drives on business critical Azure SQL and Azure SQL Managed Instance to make sure it worked properly before they made them available to consumers on the VMs. And I'm glad that they've done it because as kind of an old-fashioned DBA, which I'm old enough, and I guess I've done it long enough, is that I still like turning the knobs and I like seeing everything, which is why I'm still like having VMs, because you can configure them the way that you want to. Something about dealing with the fact where everything is controlled by the vendor as far as the server bothers me a little bit. And it can be complicated because, especially with Azure SQL, is that you can't see really what's going on behind the scenes. You have to put in a special request. And even when I've been able to work with the right engineer from Microsoft, they still won't show you everything. They'll give you a little bit and say, well, this is probably where you're going wrong, but they're not letting you see what's going on behind the covers. Azure SQL Managed Instance is a little bit different, but it's still kind of the same sort of concept. Hyperscale, I've only worked with a little bit, so I can't talk too much, but I know that it is using UltraDisk. It's just a matter of how much you're going to pay for. This right here, I just wanted to show the difference here. You can see, so right here, this is general purpose, and you can see the cost here. And so part of it is a limitation too. So if you pay attention, you see right here, is that, so I allocated, this was the maximum that it allowed me to allocate, which is 665 gigabytes. And you can see what the cost is here too, $76 per month. Now, if we go up to business critical, so first of all, is I can do roughly double the storage. I can do 1.3 terabytes, which actually in reality is 1 terabyte. Then they give you 300 log, but you look at how the price goes up so much dramatically. So you're going from $76 a month for your storage to $1,324 per month. So you're definitely paying for a much higher quality of disk, which again, Azure SQL is just, the core stuff is using blob storage, and you're going up to premium SSDs and higher. And then finally, Azure SQL Managed Instance. So this one I thought was pretty cool. So see right here. So have any of you worked with Azure SQL Managed Instance? Okay, so I mean, essentially, Managed Instance was created in order to give people the true SQL Server experience, except that you're still having platform as a service. So the fact is that the vendor is managing it for you. You don't have to worry about the OS. You don't have to worry about the storage. You don't have to worry about the server, but you can still fully control the SQL Server instance. The other thing is that it's very secure because of the fact that you have to have endpoints in order to get to it. Now they've just modified that slightly lately to make it easier, but I've always thought of Managed Instance as kind of like a Hotel California thing, because it's like once you get your data there, it's really hard to get it back out. And I know what? Yeah, you can check it anytime you like. But so this is the original, this right here, this is your general purpose Managed Instance right here. And so you can see here is that you have your server and you're providing the replication, but you can see how these dotted lines right here, this is going to, again, it's going to a SAN someplace within the Microsoft network. And that's where your backups are going to too. Now, what they are doing is that they are putting a tempdb here on a local drive, because most of the VMs have a local, the ephemeral drive, which is where you want to put tempdb when you're saying SQL Server on it, because that's going to give you your best performance. But they're also still providing the failover. But now if we go to the next slide, which has business critical, you can see right here, the main difference here is that each one of the replicas has its own local disk. So it's certainly going to speed up failover quite a bit. And it's also, they're putting much faster disk on there. And the other difference, as you can see right here, in this very small print, but it says SSD data and log. So they've gone from a fact where that they have a local disk only for tempdb on the server to having locally attached storage to the server and for all of your database transactions. And then they're also replicating that because they're all in an availability group. And so each one of the replicas has its own disk too, which is going to be much faster when the Windows cluster fails over, goes back and forth among the nodes. And that's about it. So any questions? Well, that's good. Well, thank you.
Is there timing if you're limited in somewhere in the storage capacity where you can see low storage usage, but highly for like your
Yeah, you'll get alerts. I mean, you can set all that stuff up. Azure Monitor is your friend, and you should use Azure Monitor if you can all do it. It's very simple to set up. You just have to set up a analytics workspace, which is just, it's like you want to set up an analytics workspace and you set it up. It's the perfmon is still out there, and you can still use perfmon, and I think it's good as a tool, but Azure Monitor does most of the things that perfmon does. And even just the simplest thing, there's like a at a glance sort of performance metrics. It's right there when you're looking at your VM, and there's like a metrics tab right at the very top. And that shows you all the drives that are attached to the VM. It shows you everything. Yeah, sure. All right.
I don't know from your experience working with customers here.
Mhm.
Or in our growth, you will handle with people that are very interested in knowing how to configure something, how to simplify administration and back to global with managing success. So they have then approaches to the same thing.
Yeah.
At the same time, also the guy who used to really have control of everything, why would he go to the country instead of still having everything local in his data center, having sound without latency on the network and all these things. You understand? So what have you seen in your experience working in your company, with real customers, that what is the trend, what is going on? I think
Well-
going to the management instance, replacing this.
It's a couple different things. I mean, you know, sometimes it's just as simple as just staffing. I mean, that's for some reason, it's not that there's fewer people in this world, but there seems to be fewer people that want to work. And that seems to be part of the problem. And then companies are having employees age out. As far as a money thing, I know that one of the things that Microsoft talks about is the fact that you can change it to an operating expense. So the idea is that you can just have instead of having, you can save some money on payroll, even though that's not really true, but you can, it just kind of changes who you write the check to. It makes it a little bit simpler. So for some reason, it's still money. And in fact, it usually costs more. In fact, there was an interesting article that was written by a fellow up in Canada, I think it was. And so he actually said he saved $1 million a year by going from Azure back to local data centers because he was spending so much on that. But I think you're going to see more of that. The main advantage of VMs, I think, is just the flexibility. It's just so nice, the fact that you can, once you get really skilled, with PowerShell or using Bicep or something like that, and the fact that you can spin up the same servers, it's almost like magic. Once you get your scripting down, and I understand you're going to get the same experience at a local data center. But I remember back when, you have a server built and it would take days. Right. Right. Yeah, it's just so nice. That you can literally within a half hour you can spin up a server, and you have full control over it. Ideally, depending on your Azure subscription, and you can do what you want with it, and then you can kill it, and you only get charged like maybe a few dollars for that experience. No, yeah, right. Talking about Domino's way back. That was a long time ago. That was back in like 2005, I think it was. That's only been easier now. Overall, one of the things that I haven't had a chance to work on yet, I'm hoping I get to work on a project where I would like to work with a customer who wants to have cloud native applications, because usually most people are trying to shoehorn their existing applications into the cloud environment, and it works well enough, but it's not really any different than just kind of moving from one house to another. And I think what would be interesting is to see some of the flexibility of having that like a cloud native type application or one that's been rewritten. But it's a matter of getting the right customers and the right vendors and everyone together too. Yeah, I'm a little bit cynical. You can probably tell some of my comments. I'm not disparaging what Microsoft has done. I think that they've provided a tremendous service, and it's incredibly useful to companies all over the world. And the stability and the flexibility and the dependability is the best thing about it too. You literally don't have to worry about things as much anymore. You get things running and they work just great. but they're going to charge you for that because I think about the amount of time it must have been to figure out how to make it work precisely the same way every time. That's what kind of amazes me actually, is that how did they get it so right? And you wonder how long it took in development to get it to that point. Yeah, exactly. Even though I will say a couple months ago had the worst possible Burger King burger. I think that, like everything, nothing was melted and it was just, yeah, lack of consistency. Yeah. All right. Well, I think I'm gonna leave the Teams meeting. Any questions from anyone out there? Let's see. Yeah, Scott, I can appreciate that. It's funny how you put all that time into doing it, and then all of a sudden the things don't work. Yeah, I mean, imagine you're basically going back to the, what you have to import, download. Yeah, see, it just, anyway. That's not quite the right way to do it. I think that's one of the problems with moving to the cloud is I think that moving to the cloud is going to show you all the pain points and all the things that were covered up. That's one of the reasons why I had that picture of showing the catio to the cat in the tiny little box, is that all of a sudden you realize, and one of my other slides that I actually took off that I used to have on here, where I would show a traditional like Chinese buffet where you can eat more food than you should, and then going to dim sum, where you have to pick your plates very carefully. And I think that's an apt analogy of going from a more traditional data center where you have a lot more wiggle room, going to the cloud where everything is carefully measured out. Just something to be aware of. The point I want to make with this presentation is that the old stuff is still all the old concepts. Nothing has truly changed. It's just that, I mean, things have been gussied up a little bit. They've been made fancier, faster, prettier, but it's still the same ideas. I mean, that's why they keep an idea of latency and IOPS. And I mean, you just have to keep with the technology a little bit, but you're still the same ideas. So anyway, thank you.